At Banque de France and within the NGFS, we are currently working on the design of macro-financial climate scenarios. The NGFS has already published 2 vintages of scenarios, providing detailed information on 6 scenarios, illustrating different unfolding of physical and transition risk for 132 countries, with an additional focus on about 15 sectors. These scenarios underpin more than 30 stress testing exercises, enabling the authorities in charge of financial stability to better understand the possible impact of climate change-related development on individual financial institutions and on the financial system. These scenarios should not only be updated, but also completed and improved. The 2 main topics at this stage are the macroeconomic and financial impacts of acute physical risk on one side, and the short and medium-term macroeconomics of the net zero transition on the other. With regard to acute physical risk, academic research is ongoing, both to model this risk in a forward-looking manner and to assess the macroeconomic and financial impacts of extreme climate events. The Banque de France is currently focusing its effort toward short and medium-term macroeconomic developments, seeking to better understand not only the long-term implication of the transition, but also the likely shorter-term developments associated with the necessary acceleration of the transition. The report of the first working group of the IPCC, published this summer, has made it clear. The transition is a long-term project whose success hinges on decisive transformation in the very short term already. While climate change is accelerating before our eyes, if we just stabilize CO2 emissions, we have a remaining carbon budget of 6 to 7 years worth of CO2 emissions if we want to have a 4 out of 5 chances to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. As a consequence, achieving 1.5 degrees requires very significant change in the next 6 or 7 years. Such a transformation will have macroeconomic implications. Understanding them is critical for economic policymaking. In particular, from a central bank perspective, it is critical for monetary policymaking and for assessing risk and monitoring financial stability. When designing macro-financial climate scenarios, we seek to sketch out plausible futures that are not forecasts, but consistent macro-financial transition pathways. The design of these scenarios hinges on both a microeconomic and a macroeconomic understanding of the net zero transition. The microeconomics of the transition is now rather well understood. The cost of low-carbon alternative is increasingly on par with that of legacy technologies. Eventually, the problem is to decisively shift the demand toward these solutions through pricing carbon or overcoming the lock-in effects associated with the existence of network externalities. The macroeconomics of the transition, on the other hand, remains largely uncharted territory. We understand what the economy is likely to look like in the long run, but much less how it will react to the acceleration of the transition in the short term. How would the global economy react to an increase in the relative price of carbon, especially if the low-carbon alternatives are not available at scale? What would be the impact of a surge in investment in low-carbon technologies associated with the early retirement of productive capital relying on high-carbon legacy technologies? How the various friction in the economy will shape the dynamics? And looking at international trade and finance, how will global trade and capital flows shift in the course of the transition? Eventually, what will be the political economic consequences of these domestic and international developments? So far, the transition toward the net zero global economy has been understood as a long-term transition. A transition that could be gradual enough for the macroeconomics to be dominated by the microeconomics. We now understand that the macroeconomics of the transition will matter a great deal. The transition should unfold in only a few years, and our understanding will deeply impact its eventual success. We can misunderstand the macroeconomics of the transition and make it more difficult or costlier. Or we can understand what the sum of all the micro decisions that needs to happen means for the economy as a whole, and make sure that fiscal and monetary policies not only adapt to this transformation, but contribute to accelerate and smoothen the transition.